The next question, we will start with Mr. Bledsoe. It is to both candidates for 60 seconds. Will you support right to work when proposed?
No, I actually agree with gubernatorial candidate Rick Snyder on this. When you think about it, fewer than 19% of all workers in our state are unionized today. And so a right to work law in our state would affect really fewer than 20% of the total workforce in the state. And so it would have a relatively modest impact within the state. And yet the battle over right to work in Lansing would lead to really blood in the streets. It's just not worth the blood spread that would occur to try to push through a right to work law. And I'm not at all sure, in my own thinking, that a right to work law would lead to substantial new economic development. Do we really want to compete with low-wage states like Alabama and Mississippi for economic development, or do we want to compete with the New Yorks and Massachusetts and Minnesotas for economic development?
Thank you. Mrs. DuMouchelle.
Well, you know, Michigan has a long and proud union tradition. Right to work is a very divisive issue. We have real problems in Michigan, and we don't need it'd be an unending boxing match, and it could end with blood in the streets. You know, that's always a possibility. We have real problems here that can't be addressed if we have all this fighting, partisan fighting. We just can't do it. I'm not naive to know that there still won't be some partisanship, but most people think this state needs to get working again, and I think we just need to stick together and put the open for business sign back in Michigan.
Thank you. The next question is for both candidates, and we will start with Mrs. DuMouchelle. How do you feel about our new filmmaking in Michigan and the tax credit?
When an issue like this comes up, I ask myself 3 questions. Number 1, does it create jobs? Number 2, does it bring in revenue? And number 3, are the regulations involved in it? It creates jobs and it brings in revenue. So the answer is yes to 2 of those questions. Plus the film industry is really kind of focused on young people, kind of a hip kind of an industry to be in. So I would hope as the industry in Michigan matures, we can get some of the brain drain that's left this state to come back and enjoy the issues that we have here. But we also need broad-based tax relief for all businesses. We shouldn't be trying to pick winners and losers. We need to do, again, a little economic gardening where we nurture everyone who is already here, not out hunting for other industries to bring in.
Thank you. Mr. Bledsoe.
Well, Mrs. DuMouchelle is absolutely right. Government shouldn't be in the business of picking winners and losers. And yet when we offer overly generous tax credits in certain industries, to certain companies, that we are effectively picking winners and losers. What we really need in this state is a level playing field, a single low tax rate for all businesses so that all businesses can prosper in our state. I personally think that the Michigan film tax is overly generous, and indeed the Senate Fiscal Agency, that's the Senate Fiscal Agency where Majority Leader Mike Bishop is in charge. They've recently released a report where they agree that the state is losing money, losing a substantial amount of money on that film tax incentive.
Thank you. The next question, also for both candidates, we'll start with Mr. Bledsoe. If elected, would you support legislation to allow early and no excuse absentee voting in Michigan?
Absolutely. You know, we need to do everything that we can to encourage voting. The voter turnout in the coming election will be probably between 35 and 40% in our state. 35 and 40% of all citizens participating in an election that will choose a governor, secretary of state, attorney general, every single seat in our state House and state Senate and decide on whether or not to call a constitutional convention. You know, no excuse absentee voting would be an easy change that we could make to allow people to get those ballots in advance, fill those ballots out in the comfort of their home, and mail the ballots in. And I think that we would see voter turnout, voter participation go up by maybe 5 or 10% if we did that.
Thank you. Mrs. DuMouchelle.
Well, early voting is an interesting concept that I could possibly consider, but it also opens up the door to a lot of fraud. If you have ballots that are out there, what kind of safeguards do we have? So we have to keep that issue in mind. Maybe we should look at something like having changing the voting from Tuesday in November to maybe the weekend when more people are available. That's another option. Have it be a Saturday and Sunday. You can go vote at your voting place. That would be another alternative.
Thank you. The next question for both candidates, we'll start with Mrs. DuMouchelle. What is your view on guns in American society?
Well, I'm a firm believer in the Second Amendment. Gun safety should be, it used to be taught in schools. I don't know if it should be, but I think people need to have respect for guns. And as long as the laws of our land are upheld, there shouldn't be a problem. We do have gun laws in place to keep guns out of the hands of criminals. They don't always seem to be upheld.
Thank you. Mr. Bledsoe?
Well, I'm a gun owner, and in my younger years, at least, I did some hunting, although not in the last several decades. And I support people's right to own guns as a normal course of things, and the Second Amendment rights to own guns. On the other hand, there was a recent episode where people wanted to openly carry guns to a street festival in Royal Oak where alcohol is served. It doesn't make any sense to me that people would be allowed to take firearms, loaded firearms, to an event where alcohol is served. So I think we do need legislation, if it's not on the books now, and apparently it's not, we do need legislation to see to it that we have a nice division, a nice wall between consumption of alcoholic beverages and presence of handguns or firearms.
Thank you. Hang in there, we only have a few more. The next question we'll start with Mr. Bledsoe, and it is for both of you, 60 seconds. Mr. Bledsoe, would you ever support capital punishment under any circumstances?
Well, first of all, we have a constitutional prohibition on capital punishment in the state of Michigan that is the longest standing prohibition on capital punishment in the English-speaking world. And I'm very proud to be a resident of a state that very early on took a principled stand against capital punishment. You know, with modern forensic science, we are now learning that indeed there have been some occasions in recent years where people have been put to death who were later proved innocent. That's a mistake that we just simply can't afford to make. And so at the state level, no, I am opposed to having capital punishment in Michigan.
Thank you. Mrs. DuMouchelle.
Here's another area we agree on, Tim. I also oppose capital punishment. I believe in right to life, including people who are convicted of crimes. They spend hours and hours and dollars on death row trying to get out of it. And it's not a deterrent. Capital punishment is not a deterrent to crime. It has been proven it is not. So it's an area that if somebody is convicted of a crime, that normally would have gone to capital punishment. We just need to make sure that person is never let out of prison in his lifetime or her lifetime.
Thank you. The next question is to Mr. Bledsoe, and it's for 90 seconds. Why didn't Michigan get race to the top funds?
Whew. Well, that's a very good question. It's one that you know, the decision about which states would be awarded race to the top funds was a decision made in Washington, not in Lansing. I can tell you that we on the Education Committee worked late into the night, several days. We were there on Saturday working to try to craft a proposal for race to the top funding that would be competitive with other states. I really can't speak to the decision of the U.S. Department of Education and the criteria that they used to choose the states that they chose for funding for Race to the Top. I can tell you that we in the legislature, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, worked very hard to secure that funding. And we were very disappointed when it failed.
Thank you. Mrs. DuMouchelle, would you care to comment?
I can understand that it would be disappointing because it was disappointing for everyone in this state. I don't know what the criteria was for it, but we should have been better prepared, I think, to make sure that we were eligible and were awarded that Race to the Top funding.
Thank you. Last question before the closing statements. It is addressed to Mr. Bledsoe, so he will have 90 seconds to respond. The Michigan Republican Party is circulating flyers that accuse you of supporting a bill to raise property taxes during the recession, HB 4700. How do you explain your support for this bill?
Well, I'm delighted to get that question. That particular bill is a bill that allows local governments and school districts to enter into partnerships to form recreational districts. Now, the argument that's made is that if your local governments should enter into this partnership, and if the partnership should decide that they want to go to the voters for a funding millage, and if a majority of the voters approve that funding millage, then your property taxes would go up, and it would be Tim Bledsoe's fault. And so this is really, it is a preposterous accusation. It's among the several preposterous accusations that are made in the glossy flyers that are being circulated around the district coming from the Michigan Republican Party.
Thank you. Mrs. DuMouchelle, would you care to comment?
Well, as Tim so well knows, that again, we do not have any control as candidates what the party puts on. I've seen some things in his literature from the Democratic Party, which gets PAC funds to put on these glossy mail-outs. But it was an issue where those funds were supposed to be used for capital expenditures, not for capital expenditure, but for brick and mortar expenditures. It's not supposed to be for anything other than brick and mortar expenditures. That's where it would come in that your property taxes would go up.
Thank you.